We live in an interconnected world, where frontiers like the Schengen area are becoming lines in the ground, and where the next song you hear may come from a singer from a different country or singing in a different language. Our lives are interconnected with each other more than at any other point in history due to the massive advances in technology of communications and the accessibility of flights and automobiles that allows us to move massive distances in minutes. But not all places are alike. Some countries have less accessibility to such mediums or suffer restrictions from governments. With such consideration in mind, one wonders whether the reality of globalization is perhaps different depending on where you live. My name is Alejandro Briceno and I welcome you all to my first virtual symposium. Today I will be showcasing my research on globalization and the factors that determine the level of globalization in a particular country. So, let's get started. In this presentation, I will start with the research question and the literature review to give a proper description of the variables involved and the objective of this research. Then I will proceed with the data methodology section, table 1, and the hypothesis in question. Furthermore, I will provide the findings of this research, which will also be comprised of scatter plots for each independent variable and ANOVAs for original values, alongside another table and then the conclusion of our research. As an extra, I've decided to also include a multiple regression analysis to showcase what would happen if all variables were experienced at the same time. So, for this research, we start with our question: what factors predict the level of globalization across nations? On the literature review, we'll first have to consider what the definition of globalization will be. For this research, we will be using the definition provided by the UNESCO, which describes globalization as referring to all those processes by which the peoples of the world are incorporated into a single world society, global society. Summarized, our first article, Human Development in the Age of Globalization, claims that globalization brings forth economic growth, but in the same way allows for recessions to happen globally, which in turn affect the level of human development in the world, thus connecting globalization with human development. The next articles claim similar relationships, with the article Globalization and its effects on world poverty and inequality claiming a relationship between poverty and globalization. The article Globalization of Freedoms claims that the normalization of the world freedom globally is a result of globalization. The article Does Globalization Affect Growth, claiming a connection between globalization and economics. The article Corruption and Globalization, claiming a relationship between both variables. And lastly, the article Population and Globalization, which points out a relationship between globalization and how population has become a demographic trend because of it. So, for this research, we have a total of 6 independent variables and 1 dependent variable. The dependent variable is the level of globalization, and the independent variables are the Corruption Perception Index, or CPI, which is a data source used by Transparency International to provide ideas on the amount of corruption on a country. The more CPI, the more transparency. We also have the per capita GDP, population density, Human Development Index, or HDI, the level of income inequality, and the level of freedom. For this research, our unit of analysis is geographical, taking into account the recognized 193 members of the United Nations without including partially recognized states or observer states. For our first table, we have the summary statistics of dependent and independent variables. It is important to take away that our data source sources are from various recognized institutions. Moreover, for our dependent variable, we have a minimum score of 30.33 and a maximum score of 91.32. Furthermore, the mean for this variable is 63.013. All of these values can be found for each variable on our table. These are the hypotheses. To summarize, this research expects to see a positive relationship between the variable of globalization and the independent variables of per capita GDP, population density, HDI, and level of freedom. This research also expects to find a negative relationship between globalization and income inequality. Moreover, for regional values, this research expects to see countries with higher amounts of globalization in the northern hemisphere of each continent and in the western hemisphere of the world. Here are our findings. Due to the time limitations of this symposium, we will only provide the three most notorious scatter plots of our research. Starting with the CPI scatter plot, we find that the correlation coefficient is 0.739, which makes it a significant positive correlation. The coefficient of determination is 0.54, which means that knowing this variable alone could account for up to 54% of the globalization rate. In regards to the intercept slope, for every unit increase of the CPI score, there is a change of 0.562 on the value of globalization. Moreover, when the CPI score is at 0, the level of globalization stays at 39.499. The correlation supports the previously mentioned hypothesis, and it is safe to say that the null hypothesis for this variable is rejected. Next, we have the HDI scatterplot, the high scatterplot of our research. The correlation coefficient is 0.828, which makes it a significant positive correlation. The coefficient of determination is 0.68, which means that knowing this variable could account for up to 68% of the globalization rate. In regards to the intercept slope, for every unit increase of HDI, there is a change of 77.687 on the value of globalization. Moreover, when HDI is 0, the level of globalization stays at 8.123. The correlation supports the previously mentioned hypothesis, and it is safe to say that the null hypothesis for this variable is rejected. Lastly, we have the income inequality scatterplot. The correlation coefficient is minus 0.438, which makes it a significant negative correlation. The coefficient of determination is 0.19, which means that knowing this variable could account for up to 19% of the globalization rate. In regards to the intercept slope, for every unit increase of income inequality, there is a negative change of minus 0.714 on the value of globalization. Moreover, when income inequality is 0, the level of globalization stays at 93.106. The correlation supports the previously mentioned hypothesis, and it is safe to say that the null hypothesis for this variable is rejected. Now we proceed with our two ANOVAs. The purpose of these are to provide an image of how countries perform as a group and to identify any particular trends. For this ANOVA, all member states were assigned to their particular regions of the world and classified into 5 different continents. The eta square for this calculation is 0.486 with an overall mean of 63.013. This tells us that knowing the region can explain almost 48.6% of the value in the globalization score. Some very interesting findings are that the continents of Africa, Asia, and Oceania are behind the overall mean, and the Americas struggle to stay on top of the mean, while Europe has a clear distance above the mean, with the exception of its 4 city-states. We also find out that Switzerland has the overall highest score, and Eritrea has the lowest, and Oceania only has New Zealand and Australia above the mean, while the rest of the continent stays behind. To increase our perspective of this, a second ANOVA was designed, this time dividing the continents into regions to better observe their characteristics. The eta square is 0.634 and the overall mean is the same as the previous ANOVA due to no changes in the data. Our previous hypothesis for the region value can be observed more properly in this ANOVA. All the northern regions of each continent do have a higher score in comparison to the rest of the regions. Moreover, the Western Hemisphere of Europe, the Americas, and Australia/New Zealand do have a significant leap in globalization scores in comparison to countries found in the Eastern Hemisphere. Table 2 has all of our correlation scores. We find that CPI and HDI have the highest positive significant scores of the variables, with per capita GDP and level of freedom also having decent positive significant correlations. The level of income inequality has the only negative significant correlation, and population density has a non-significant negative correlation, which means that we fail to reject the null hypothesis for population density. As an extra feature, this research also performed a multiple regression analysis on all the independent variables. When placed together, we find that our test, or the lowercase t, has the CPI and HDI being highly positive significant values, while this time per capita GDP and income inequality have a strong negative correlation value. Freedom scores and population density were not significant on our multiple regression analysis. In conclusion, the null hypothesis is rejected for all variables except population density. In regards to that variable, we fail to reject the null hypothesis. For our future research, we would recommend a time series study to changes in globalization rates of the 21st century from the year 2000 to 2019 to provide insight towards the current trends of globalization and perhaps give us ideas to where the trend is heading. Increasing the scope of the research is also an idea that we request, as we were not able to explore variables like education, ideologies, languages, and religion, which could be highly connected to the dependent variable. That was all for today. Thank you for listening, and I hope this research was worth your time. Have a good day.